Hello, welcome to Unit 5 of our course. In this unit we will be exploring major developments in the 1980s and early 1990s. There are three major themes that we will be addressing in this unit. One is the collapse and disintegration of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. A second is President Reagan's administration. And a third is the rise of the Christian right. There are three assignments that you are asked to complete for this unit. The first assignment is your participation in a discussion board forum. You are asked, as usual, to make a minimum of 3 posts to the discussion forum, and the discussion board question relates to the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. As we learned earlier in the course, the Cold War began at the end of World War II in 1945. The Cold War continued for roughly 45 years and finally comes to an end in 1991. In this unit, I would ask you to consider the factors that led to the end of the Cold War and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. At the beginning of the 1980s, no one would have imagined that the Soviet Union would cease to exist, only a decade later. The Soviet Union appeared very strong at the beginning of the 1980s. In 1980, the Soviet Union had just launched an invasion of Afghanistan. The Soviet Union was flexing its might abroad, and the Soviet Union seemed to be a permanent force on the international political stage. There is much debate about what brought about the fall of the Soviet Union. And the discussion board question asks you to consider America's role in the collapse of the Soviet Union. To what extent should we view the disintegration of the Soviet Union as an American victory in the Cold War? Was the United States principally responsible for the collapse and disintegration of the Soviet Union? I'd like to offer a few comments on that in this short video introduction. The Soviet Union, while it was a great military power, was facing serious economic challenges by the 1980s, which would accelerate during the decade. The Soviet economy was never as strong as the United States economy, and problems multiplied quickly. One problem was the basic structure of the Soviet economy. The Soviet Union had a command economy, which are notoriously problematic. In a command economy, the government owns all industry, the government owns all agricultural land, the government owns basically all of the means of production. So all goods and services are produced by the government. There is no free market in a command economy. A free market exists when private individuals can buy and sell goods. So in a free market, individuals can start businesses, can sell product with the goal of making a profit. That did not exist in the Soviet economy. So in the Soviet economy, all businesses, all industries, even all farmland was owned and operated by the government. As a result, there is no interaction of supply and demand in a command economy. In other words, the government decides what goods will be produced and how the goods will be distributed. There is no way for individual consumer desires, demands, wants to influence the production of goods. In a free market economy, if there is great demand for a good, if consumers really want a particular product, the price of that product will increase, and the private manufacturer of the product will have an incentive to produce more. So high demand actually leads to increased production of a given product. Conversely, if there's very little demand for a particular product, let's say a music album that turns out not to be popular, the price of the product will fall, the company will decide not to produce as much or any of the product anymore, and their demand again influences production. In a command economy, this doesn't exist. The government simply produces what it believes consumers need, and then provides that to the public. It's a very inefficient way to conduct an economy, to run an economy. And the Soviet people suffered as a result, not just the people of the Soviet Union, but of the Soviet satellite states, all of the communist-controlled states of Eastern Europe. If you compared Eastern Europe to Western Europe in the 1980s, Eastern Europe was, relatively speaking, impoverished. If you went into a supermarket in the Soviet Union in the 1980s, oftentimes the shelves were virtually empty. People would stand in line for hours waiting to get basic commodities, basic goods. If you wanted to purchase an automobile, you might have to wait on a government waiting list for 5 or 6 years before you would have the opportunity to purchase an automobile. So there were serious economic struggles. New political leadership began to recognize the serious flaws in the Soviet economy. A bit about the new political leadership. Throughout the history of the Soviet Union, up to the 1980s, the Soviet state had been ruled by the generation that had lived through the First and Second World Wars, by the revolutionary generation, the generation that had witnessed the Communist Revolution of 1917-1918. However, by the 1980s, this generation was growing old, was advanced in age. And in the early 1980s, several Soviet leaders died in rapid succession because the men being appointed to the position of Soviet premier were now in their 80s. Ronald Reagan, the President of the United States at the time, quipped, "How can I negotiate with the Soviets when they keep dying on me?" Ultimately, the leadership of the Soviet Union decided that a shift had to take place, that a new generation had to be brought into the leadership. And Mikhail Gorbachev was chosen to be the new leader of the Soviet Union in 1985. Mikhail Gorbachev was not an incredibly young man, but he was much younger than the previous Soviet leaders. He was in his early 50s. And he was from a different generation. He had no memory of the First World War. He had no memory of the Communist Revolution. He did recall the Second World War, but as an adolescent, not as someone who had fought in the war or participated in politics during the war. So his worldview was radically different than the previous generation. The previous generation of Soviet leaders had a siege mentality, meaning they constantly thought about the threats that existed to the Soviet Union because they had experienced the First and Second World Wars profoundly. Gorbachev had a different perspective. Gorbachev was more open to negotiation with the West. Gorbachev did not view the United States and the West as an evil empire, as a serious threat. He did not view the West as naturally an enemy of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was open to reform. Furthermore, Gorbachev recognized that the Soviet economic model was deeply flawed. And Mikhail Gorbachev wanted to introduce reforms. He introduced an economic reform program known as Perestroika. Under this program, elements of free market capitalism were introduced into the Soviet economy. Suddenly, individuals were allowed to start their own businesses. Individuals were allowed to sell goods for a profit. Some farmland was returned to private owners. Gorbachev was open to implementing these basically Western-style free market economic reforms. He was not totally abandoning the state model, the command economy model. He envisioned that the major industries, utilities, railways would continue to be operated by the government, but he was willing to experiment with free market reforms in the hope that this would improve the economy. Furthermore, Gorbachev recognized that there were serious political problems in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was an incredibly repressive state. There was only a single political party that was allowed to exist, the Communist Party. Anyone who criticized the Communist Party would be imprisoned in prison camps in Siberia. It was very oppressive. There is no free speech, no freedom of the press, no democracy. Gorbachev set out to change that. Gorbachev introduced a series of political forms known as glasnost. Glasnost means openness. Political prisoners were released from prison. People who had been thrown in prison for criticizing the government were released. Newspapers were allowed to publish stories that were critical of the government. And even some democratic reforms were implemented, at least at the local level. Suddenly people could vote for the office of mayor, for example. The worst repression was eliminated, was ended. Gorbachev hoped these reforms would improve the Soviet Union. Meanwhile, we can look at the actions that Ronald Reagan's administration were taking. Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980, would serve as president from 1980 to 1988, and his approach to the Soviet Union shifted over time. When Reagan first came into office, he took an incredibly hard-line stance against the Soviet Union. This was before Gorbachev came to power in 1985. Reagan denounced the Soviet Union as an evil empire. He argued that the goal of American policy should be for the Soviet Union to cease to exist as a state. And Reagan, in the early 1980s, launched a massive arms buildup. The United States spent huge sums of money in the early 1980s, massively rebuilding the United States military. The United States military had become somewhat demoralized following the Vietnam War's unsuccessful conclusion in 1975. There was a lack of investment in the United States military in the late 1970s. Reagan massively increased funding and support for the United States military. Reagan reportedly told his defense secretary, "Don't worry about the budget, spend whatever is necessary to strengthen the United States military." This was part of a clear plan. Reagan's advisors pointed out that the Soviet Union was very weak economically, and that the United States could put extreme economic pressure on the Soviet Union by reigniting the arms race. When the United States ramped up spending on the military, Soviet leaders believed they had no choice but to do the same. They were not willing to allow the United States to move too far ahead in terms of weapons development. So the Soviet Union began to invest massive amounts of money into weapons development in the early 1980s, money that they could not afford. The goal of the Reagan administration was to bankrupt the Soviet Union, to drive the Soviet Union into an incredibly severe financial crisis, which is exactly what happened. That was the precursor to Gorbachev's economic reform efforts. Now, this created great controversy in America. Many people thought that this was reckless, that it was provoking antagonism with the Soviets, and that it could potentially spiral into a nuclear war, even into a direct confrontation, which was certainly possible. So Reagan travels to Western Europe, demands that Mikhail Gorbachev tear down the Berlin Wall, is making these sort of extremely provocative rhetorical statements and speeches, meanwhile organizing a massive arms buildup explicitly to put pressure on the Soviet Union. At the same time as all this is going on, in the late 1980s, actually in the early 1980s even, you begin to see the stirrings of pro-democracy movements in Eastern Europe, in countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. You begin to see people yearning for democracy. This was not entirely new. As early as the 1950s, in 1956, the people of Hungary had risen up in rebellion against their communist dictatorship, demanding democracy. In 1968, the people of Czechoslovakia rose up in rebellion against their communist government, demanding democratic reform. In both of these instances, in 1956 and 1968, the Soviet Union sent in military forces and violently crushed the pro-democracy movements, slaughtering tens of thousands of people in the streets. In the early 1980s, you begin to see the reemergence of these pro-democracy movements in the communist dictatorships of Eastern Europe. And the big question is, what will the Soviets do about this? The first big test was Poland. In Poland, the pro-democracy movement was led by a labor union movement known as Solidarity. Solidarity had become a large-scale movement in Poland by 1980, attracting a tremendous amount of support from the public, and their goal was not just labor union goals. The goal of Solidarity was to reestablish democracy in Poland. They were confronting a hardline communist dictatorship, which had originally been put in power by the Soviet Union, in fact. The new Pope gave encouragement, the leader of the Roman Catholic Church gave encouragement to the pro-democracy movement. In 1979, a man named Karol Wojtyła, who was a bishop from Poland, a cardinal from Poland, was elevated to the position of Pope within the Roman Catholic Church, the first non-Italian to become Pope in 1,000 years. He travels to Poland and gives explicit public support to Solidarity, to the pro-democracy movements in Poland, and tells them, be not afraid. Do not be afraid to protest against your government. Fast forward to Mikhail Gorbachev's time in office, starting in 1985. Mikhail Gorbachev sends a clear message to the dictators of Eastern Europe. You need to implement reforms. He tells the dictators of Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, you must implement democratic reforms, as I am doing in the Soviet Union. None of the leaders of Eastern Europe are responsive to this. None of them are interested in implementing pro-democracy reforms. They fear that this will lead to their own fall from power. So the communist dictators of Poland and East Germany and all of the other states, they refused to implement pro-democratic reforms, ignoring Mikhail Gorbachev's advice. But Mikhail Gorbachev tells them there will be no Soviet tanks this time. If you fail to implement democratic reforms and the people rise up against you, don't expect Soviet soldiers to bail you out, to march through the streets, to crush the pro-democracy movements. That will not happen again. This is a critical turning point. It becomes clear in Poland in 1988. In 1988 in Poland, massive pro-democracy protests break out. By 1989, the government is overwhelmed by the force of the pro-democracy movement. No Soviet tanks come to their aid, and the Polish government is toppled. It falls through a largely nonviolent revolution, and a democratic state is established in Poland. The peoples in the rest of the countries of Eastern Europe witness this, and they're inspired by this. And within just 2 years, every communist dictatorship in Eastern Europe collapses. Between 1989 and the end of 1990, pro-democracy forces, largely through peaceful revolutions, bring about the collapse of all of the communist dictatorships in Eastern Europe. Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, all of these governments topple and fall. It's one of the largest pro-democracy movements in human history. Of course, the United States had been encouraging these pro-democracy movements for decades by promoting an alternative voice to communist propaganda. The United States had been broadcasting Western radio, had been broadcasting pro-democracy messages into Eastern Europe, had been providing secretly funding for pro-democracy movements in Eastern Europe, had been encouraging democratic protests in the region for decades. And finally, this comes to fruition. So now that all of the states of Eastern Europe have experienced pro-democratic revolutions, increasing pressure builds on the Soviet Union. First, the Baltic states declare their independence from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union consisted of 15 separate republics. Many people don't realize that. Russia was just the largest of the republics. It also included states like Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, the Ukraine, Belarus, etc. So first the Baltics break free. And soon there are massive demonstrations in Russia itself. The Soviet Union ceases to exist when the people of Russia embrace reform. The masses of Russia rise up in rebellion against the Soviet system, and they demand change. The military of the Soviet Union tried to prevent this from happening. At the last moment in 1991, the military of the Soviet Union tried to stage a coup against Mikhail Gorbachev. They tried to remove him from power, in fact, and to establish a military dictatorship. But this plot was foiled, was a failure, and ultimately the pro-democracy forces in Russia were successful. Together, the presidents of Russia, each republic had its own president. The presidents of Russia, Belarus, and Ukraine declared the independence of their states from the Soviet Union in 1991, which meant effectively that the Soviet Union ceased to exist as a state. A few months later, Mikhail Gorbachev was effectively forced to declare the dissolution of the Soviet Union in December of 1991. He was forced by the president of Russia, Boris Yeltsin, who was the leader of the pro-democracy movement in the country. So the Soviet Union disintegrated into its constituent republics. This brings an end to the Cold War. The Cold War at this point no longer exists because the Soviet Union ceases to exist. And that starts the debate about, was this a victory for America? Clearly, the United States had hoped that the Soviet Union would disintegrate at some point. The United States had put pressure on the Soviet Union for many decades. But interestingly, it wasn't American military action that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was an internal pro-democracy movement, which the United States certainly encouraged, but it was ultimately the millions of people who demonstrated in the streets that brought about the dissolution of the Soviet state. It was Russians that brought about the dissolution of the Soviet Union, not the American military marching through the streets. The other topics that we're covering this week, just briefly, you'll be looking at a film related to Ronald Reagan's presidency. It's called Ronald Reagan, The Role of a Lifetime. It presents a largely positive view of Reagan's presidency. Reagan's presidency is controversial. There are some who consider it praiseworthy. There are others who are very critical of Reagan's presidency. I think that this will come to light through our discussions as well. I'll be interested in your thoughts on the film and what you thought of the depiction of Reagan within the film. Again, I ask that you critically analyze the films. And then you are asked to read an essay from your book and respond to the questions. The essay is entitled The Christian Right. Ronald Reagan was really the first modern conservative to be elected president. There had been other Republicans. Dwight Eisenhower was elected president in the 50s. Richard Nixon was elected president in the late 60s, early 70s. But they had not really been conservatives. Reagan clearly staked his political career on the philosophy of conservatism. Reagan argued that the government of the United States had become too large. Government was a problem, not a solution, and he argued for the need to cut government funding, government services, government programs, government spending in general. Reagan also campaigned on a platform of cutting taxes. Ultimately, as president, he did oversee a massive tax cut, 2 massive tax cuts that greatly reduced the income tax rate, the federal income tax rate. He did reduce spending on federal social programs, which was quite controversial. He reduced funding in a variety of social spending programs, which led to some problems, including an increase in the homeless population of the United States. Reagan also campaigned on a moral agenda also. Part of the conservative movement was a Christian evangelical movement, which was a reaction against the counterculture of the 60s. The counterculture, the hippie movement of the 60s, had promoted cultural changes in norms and values, and there emerges a conservative reaction against this. And the conservative reaction against this is the rise of the Christian right. The rise of the evangelical Christian right is a direct response against the cultural revolution of the 60s, the summer of love, the cultural changes that were taking place in America. The Christian right would play a very influential role in supporting Reagan's election and in supporting Reagan's presidency as well. So you'll be reading an article about that subject, that topic, and answering questions related to that as well. So I hope that you will find this to be an interesting unit. I look forward to participating in the discussions. Thank you.